Welcome back. Thanks for joining me. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it. Today, we're going to do an ARB air locker in a Dana High Pinion 60. And sometimes things don't always go smooth like you plan. So that's why I actually chose this video, because sometimes you got to kind of, figure things out. This is the ARB air locker installation kit. Comes with shims, tubing, line kit, switches, things like that, solenoids. Still have to buy an air compressor. Before you pull the carrier out, make sure your bearing caps are stamped with their position, and the other side will have a stamp with a different position. If they're not stamped, take a punch and punch a 1 or a 2 punches, and then in the housing, one that will coincide with the position of the bearing cap. On this, because we're not putting in new gears, we're going to take an initial backlash measurement so that we can set the backlash the same as it was when we pulled it out. That way we won't change the wear pattern. I don't think a thousandth would really make much difference, but you never know. So my initial reading was right at 8 thousandths. Obviously I've got the axles out. You have to pull all that down. You have to pull the carrier out, which is no big deal. Take apart's easy. Leave your pinion in. If you're not changing gears, there's no reason to take that out. There's no reason to mess with it. With the carrier out, we're going to be removing the upper and lower bearings, or the left and right bearings in the real case. We're removing the ring gear bolts. We'll be installing it to this side. Now, I strongly recommend, even if you've done these before, at least look through the instructions, because sometimes things will change. And remember, you can see this bearing cap is stamped with a Y. It matches the one on the housing. This one is also stamped with a Y, but in a different position. Always retain the proper orientation of your bearing caps. These are line board. You cannot flip them upside down. Well, you can, but it'll really jack stuff up. I'm doing these differentials. If I had a way of really measuring the overall height of the old carrier with the bearings and shims in it, and then compare it with the new carrier with the shims on one side, and then I could figure out how many shims I would need on the other side with that same accurate measurement, I wouldn't need to take it apart more than once. But I don't have that ability here, at least that I would be comfortable with and knowing I would be that accurate. So what I do is I take it apart, and once the bearings are off, I measure the shims on both sides and then keep them separated. Now, if you have a carrier that's very, very close to the same, most of the time you can put the shims in on the same side and it'll all be the same. Sometimes you'll have to take a shim out of one side, put it in the other to move that carrier to the left and to the right to either increase or decrease backlash. As you're disassembling this, don't let that ring gear drop on the floor, chip it, break it. That would be a bad day. So once you get all the bolts loose, be ready to catch it. Next, pull the side bearings off. Now, I used to just use a clamshell and a press, but this cool little tool I discovered a year or two ago, which I can't believe it took me so long to purchase one, is wonderful. It pulls these bearings off and it doesn't even break them. I always go through the instructions because it's real easy to forget a step that a specific manufacturer wants you to take care of. And if there's changes in the procedure that you didn't know about because of an upgrade or something to that effect, you'll find out the hard way if you don't go through the instructions. So I really try to eliminate that headache. On this side of the carrier, you just press the bearing on with no shims. On the other side of the carrier, you will press it with the original thickness of shims. Now remember, I took a measurement of the original shim thickness and I reinstalled that thickness under this bearing on this side of the carrier. Then I took a measurement of the original shim pack and then measured it against the shim pack for the ARB. Once I had the equal amount, those are the shims I'm initially going to use on the other side. Now, just a couple things of reference. I still use a dial caliper. I prefer those over the digital calipers. To me, it's a more visual thing. But another thing I'd like to mention is sometimes when you have a thick shim and a thin shim, that thin shim can get folded. So a lot of times what I'll try to do is I'll put a somewhat thick shim on each side of a thin shim and measure them out. In this case, I've got a couple of medium shims and a couple of very thin shims, and they measured out exactly what I had on the other side for my test fit. Now I'm just going to set those aside for a few minutes. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assemble the ring gear. Now I just pull this ring gear up by hand, line up the bolt holes. Now I start a couple of these bolt holes just so I know it's lined up. Now, there's only a thread maybe holding these on, so don't draw those up with an impact gun. It needs to be closer. So I always set it down like this and get a rubber mallet and tap them down. And you can feel the ring, these 4 bolts I put in here, you can feel them pushing down. You can feel the gap with your finger. And that way you know it's lined up straight. Once you can verify that all these are threading nice and smooth and even and you don't have any cross thread happening, you know, you can use a light duty impact to zip them the rest of the way in and kind of seat the ring a little bit. And I'm going to do that, but I want to make sure every one of them threads in smooth and I don't have to worry about anything being cross threaded. Once I get them all down and snugged up, then I'm going to grab this part of the carrier with a chain wrench and torque them to spec. So, chain wrench is on here. Now this gets kind of tricky and awkward because you're trying to hold so much. A lot of times I'll set this in a vise on the ground and torque it, but I'm trying to do this on camera, so we'll see how this works. Go across star pattern. My first round with the torque wrench is probably 30 or 40 pounds below the torque spec. It just gets them all even and gets that ring gear seated. Now I'll go up to the 110, which is the spec on this. On my final round torque spec, I always grab a Sharpie. That way when I finish the torque on each bolt, I mark it. That way I know I haven't missed any. And once I've gone all the way around, I'll double check the first 1 or 2 that I started on. I know everything is torqued correctly that way. So kind of the next thing on the agenda is the shim pack that goes on the air actuator. Now there's 2 seals that go in here. Don't assemble those until you're absolutely ready for final assembly. What I like doing right now before I go any further is I test fit the carrier to make sure I have the proper preload and the backlash. Then I'm going to take it back out drill the housing, put the O-rings in, start going with my final assembly. Just for ease of installation, on my first test fit or two, I'll set the backlash and not worry as much about preload. I'll leave the preload a little bit loose. That way it's easier to take the carrier in and out. Always start the bearing cap bolts by hand and then a ratchet, and get them 25-30 pounds to do your initial backlash test, and then see where you're at. Okay, so I mic'd these shims since it tightened up and determined that it can't be that far off. So what came to my mind is I think I might have mixed up the shims, which happens. Remember, this side is fixed, and we're going to add shims to it. This side is the side that we have these shims pressed. Okay, well, I thought I may have accidentally swapped the shims when I pressed the bearings back together. That could happen real easy if I get distracted playing with the cameras trying to do videos. But I took the bearings off, swapped the shims, put the bearings back on and put it in, and I still have a real sloppy backlash. It's way tight on one side, it's really loose, going the other way. So this tells me that either this differential's been replaced at some point in time, or the carrier was machined a little off at one point in time. I don't think it's the housing because it would transfer from one carrier to the other. So either the ARB is machined a little bit different, or the original carrier is machined a little bit different. One thing that can happen, you have a tolerance of machine measurements, and if, say, the ARB carrier is machined on the high side of those tolerances and the original carrier was machined on the low side of those tolerances, they would both be correct, but if you tried swapping them, your shims would never match up. Anyway, that being said, we now have to kind of start over on the backlash shims. So I have a little trick up my sleeve. I have a Dana 60 bearing that I have reamed out on the inside, and I can slide it on my hand. So I'm going to use that bearing to set up my backlash. That way I don't have to press the bearings on and off multiple times. I can get it right on the money and then put my bearing on for final assembly. All right, so I got my 8,000s back. I ended up only needing 2 of the 3 shims that came out of it. Now, I slid these in pretty easy. So before I press my bearing on, I'm gonna add about 2 or 3 thousandths to this, just so it is much tighter in the housing and it gives some more preload. Now that I'm comfortable with where my backlash is going to end up, drill the housing, and then I'm going to use a pipe thread tap to install the bulkhead. Used for these is a pipe thread. If you don't have one, you're going to need one. Take your time with this. Getting it started nice and straight, getting your threads nice and even will save you in the long run. There's a couple things I use to clean these differentials out. First thing I do is I take a magnet and I go sweep through it really thorough, getting any of the big chunks. Then I use some carb clean, spray it out real good. That removes all the oils that could make particles stick. Then I'll take an air hose and blow it out too. Now, while I've got a differential this far apart, I'll take a real close look at those inner axle seals. If I even think there's anything wrong with those, I would replace them. I actually recommend to people replace them when you're in there, but I can do these pretty easy, so I'm willing to take the risk if they look good. But if this is something that you only do once in a while, definitely recommend putting those new inner axle seals in while you're there. I use liquid pipe dope on this. I'm not a real big fan of Teflon tape. It's a pain in the butt to get it to stay on. You just want this snug. You don't want to be a gorilla. We're clean, blown out. Ooh, pretty new axle seals, huh? I had some, so I put them in. Anyway, ready for final assembly. So I said to wait till final assembly to put these O-rings in. Now, ARB uses these double-lipped square O-rings. They're kind of a pain in the butt to get seated in here, but use a little bit of either grease or oil. I usually use oil. Get them seated in there, seated on your carrier, and then be real careful installing it. Also, you notice I'm not using a case spreader, so I usually set these up a little bit tight, and sometimes you'll have to use a brass drift and tap the races to get it in far enough to run the bearing caps in. If you are going to do that, do not hit your air actuator with the drift, only the bearing race. A lot of people have trouble with these seals leaking. I seem to be pretty lucky at it, I guess. Probably one of the trickiest parts of this is holding everything together as you're guiding it into the housing. You kind of have to line everything up and just get it pushed straight in. And once it's in most of the way, this is the part about right here where you would have to use a drift to seat it the rest of the way and then start your bearing caps. All right, got everything snugged up. Now I haven't put final torque on these, but they're close enough I could set my backlash, make sure I was correct. I'm right at 8 thousandths. Now, I centered my line. Something you can do is either hold a wrench in there, you can put a screwdriver in there, a flat blade in there, but you want to make sure when you bend this copper tube, it's not rubbing on the bearing cap, it's not interfering with any of the carrier ring gear, etc. when you fish it up there. So I unroll it and then start working it over into the hole and pulling it through. If you try to form it too soon, it becomes kind of a pain in the butt. So I'm through here. Once you get the airline formed, I'll go ahead and put final torque on the bearing caps because I want to take a final measurement with a dial indicator, make sure I got my backlash. If not exactly where it was, pretty darn close to where it was originally. Again, I don't want to change my wear pattern. It actually is at 8 thousandths. Holding a camera while checking it's a little tough. Okay, so the airline's in. There's a compression fitting, couple of bulkhead pieces, and then a line fitting that goes in here with an O-ring. I have put air to this just with the shop air, and I can hear the solenoid or actuator click, so it's a go. So now that we're all torqued, cover's ready to go back on this. Now something I will mention is I have a couple different covers for this Dana 60. Now, if I had a really deep cover, I may not have had to notch the bearing over here. I tried assembling, just put enough pressure on it to see if I had clearance, and it actually put a flat spot in my line over here. So I did have to notch this bearing in this one. Just don't go overboard. You know, all you need to do is notch it enough to where your cover clears. That's also the reason this is tucked up real nice and close. You don't want that line interfering with the cover either. This differential is ready to go. It sounds good. It's got good preload. You know, assemble some axles and fill it with fluid. Initially, my line was hitting the cover without notching that bearing cap, so I pulled the bearing cap, drummed a little notch in it, and then ran my line there. Now it clears. Okay, we're going to try for a quick recap or a very brief recap. I'm going to go through this really quick. I may forget something, but sometimes I forget stuff in the regular video too. So, doing this particular Dana 60 on a used set of gears or the original gears and just replacing a locker or a carrier. You don't need to do a paint pattern. You don't need to take the pinion out. Take the carrier out, remove the ring gear, install it to the new carrier. Make sure when you remove the bearing caps, mark them up, down, left, right so that you know where they go unless they're already marked. And then you can always mark them again just to be sure. Make sure you use a torque wrench on everything. That'll keep the bolts from being stretched like they will with an impact. It'll also keep them from backing out if you don't get them tight enough. Loctite. It doesn't hurt to use Loctite. However, if you have ring gear bolts with the serrated locking serrations on them, you don't really need to use Loctite. Those are like using a lock nut on something. It's a lock bolt. The bearing caps, same thing. They have locking washers. You probably don't need Loctite. If you're more comfortable and if the instructions say use it, use it. I just do it on a case-by-case basis. Remember, on your backlash shims, you have to have some preload to hold those bearings tight, keep that carrier from moving this way while it's in use. Once you get a backlash rating, if you need less backlash, you can take a shim out of one side, put it in the other, move the ring gear closer. If you have not enough backlash, you take a shim out of one side, put it in the other, and that'll back it back out. Once you are comfortable and everything is to the specification called for, double check torque wrench, bearing caps. Some people even double check the ring gear after it's in. I usually don't go that far, but some people do. Test your air locker before you fill it with fluid. Make sure that it actuates with your compressor. Fill it with fluid, don't overfill it. Let your gear oil work efficiently. There's a reason it has a certain level. I don't like those differential covers that allow you to overfill them because it just makes a mess. I also don't like synthetic gear oil unless it is specifically called for by that manufacturer. I think traditional gear oil pulls the heat out of the gears better. The synthetic never gets hot. It itself doesn't get hot, so there's nowhere for the heat in the gears to go. But that's just a personal preference. I don't know if there's any validity to that. I've never had a set of gears fail because I used either traditional or synthetic oil. Anyway, fill her up and go wheeling. And thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video.